Hi, everyone. Can you hear me well? Perfect. Welcome to the Jameel Arts Centre. This is our first ever Youth Takeover, and I'm so excited to welcome all of you. A lot of new faces, which is really exciting for us always. My name is Murad. I'll tell you a bit more about myself. I come from a creative background. I practiced architecture and design prior to joining Art Jameel. Among my responsibilities are youth programs, which we have dedicated specific effort since we started the Jameel Arts Centre. In October, prior to our launch, we appointed a youth assembly. All of the members are present with me here today, except for Shaikha, who's preparing for her performance downstairs. The appointment of the youth assembly came about to basically help us as an institution to inform our decisions and our initiatives that are dedicated to youth and are youth-focused. The 9 members come from various creative disciplines, from architecture to design to art in all of its forms. Our programming has been influenced by the assembly, and this is the first manifestation, and we hopefully continue to have this kind of spirit and amazing momentum that the 9 members have brought to us as an institution. As I mentioned, today we're celebrating this takeover, and it culminates 6 months of this program. And these 6 months were mostly discussions and conversations about a lot of topics that the 9 members are interested in. And we thought these conversations are so valuable to us that we actually wanted to open them up to our entire audience by having this panel today. Throughout the 6-month period, the 9 members have actually come up with one overarching theme, which is basically sort of helped govern all of our interventions that have been produced thus far. The theme is pace, affirmations, and the now. Under this overarching theme, there were 7 curatorial briefs that the 9 members have come and put together. And following that, each one of them invited 2 to 3 artists from their immediate network to sort of respond to that theme and that curatorial statement with an intervention that we have showcased today at the center. We're very excited to be sharing this event and this entire day with you. With me on the panel is the members of the assembly, and I'll start by introducing them very briefly. On my right here is Salwa Khudairi. She's an architect. Ray, right next to her, is a multidisciplinary designer. Jenan, who is also a designer and a visual artist. Now we're going to have to do that to everyone. Abdelghani, who's also an artist. And he mostly works with sculpture. Sara bin Safwan, who's the assistant curator for Guggenheim Abu Dhabi and the founder of Banat Collective. Dina Tawil, who's also a multimedia designer. A UI designer at IBM Studios and also an illustrator. Hassan Adebayo Bello, who's right over there. Sorry, we'll come back to you. He's a software engineer turned social entrepreneur and founder of the Ajala project. And we have Arpana, who's also a multimedia designer. So as I mentioned, the point of today is to open up this kind of conversations, and they've always been very spontaneous throughout our sessions. Usually they start with different prompts, and we just hear from everyone who has some kind of response. We will have some time at the end of the panel for Q&A, so please do write down your questions if you come up with any. We're going to talk a bit about a lot of abstract notions, but also we'll delve into more contemporary issues that we want to talk about. So my first question to the 9 members of the assembly, and feel free to raise your hand to tell me if you want to go first. How do you personally define art? Anyone? Jenan, feel free to take the mic.
Yeah, so loaded question.
Yeah, of course.
I think it can be as simple as something that you take and present in a new way so that people can think about it differently.
All right. Any other one? Yeah, I know. It's a very abstract kind of question, but have you ever actually asked yourself, what is it that tells you this is art versus this is design? Or this is art, but this is something completely different? Is there kind of a criteria that you use personally to tell apart art from everything else?
I think with art, there's not really any exclusivity with it. It's very inclusive and it's meant to be for everyone. And I think also that everyone can be an artist as well. I think it's very open.
I guess to add to that is like anything that is made beyond the sort of purpose of it being functional. So, I mean, it could be functional, but that's not the only reason it's made for. So I think that's art.
So to you, it's anything that doesn't have a function?
Doesn't have to have a function.
Okay. Okay. We'll come back to that one. I'll ask you a bit more about definitions as well, and feel free to keep those as personal as possible. We all have definitions online. We can read about it in books, but I'm interested to hear about your own personal kind of view on it. What do you think contemporary art is, and how can you tell contemporary art from other types of art?
So I think contemporary art challenges the notion of art, or what is art, the definition of art, the traditional sense of what art is. I think what it does, first and foremost, is try to overcome this need for aesthetic pleasure, but also offering new ways of thinking, new ways of making, new ways of writing that are like conveyed through the work. I think the main point I would definitely draw on is this notion that art is meant to be aesthetically pleasing. And I think the more aesthetically pleasing something is, the more anesthetic it becomes, because it removes all other feelings, because all senses are just focused on the seeing, and there's no more feeling aspect, there's no more visual, any other aspects.
Amazing. And when you say when it overcomes the need for aesthetic pleasure, does that, you think, define a specific type of contemporary art? Or for you, anything that's pleasing visually is not contemporary art?
No. I think it's about the intention of the work. So if the intention carries, I want to be aesthetically pleasing, then I think it's all about the intention. And I think the trick is, obviously, intentions are not exposed, but they are also inhaled by the viewer, because as the maker breathes those intentions into the work, as the maker makes or etc., he or she always breathes those intentions intentionally or unintentionally. Actively or passively.
And when you mention intent, do you mean that if someone intended for something to be beautiful, does that border on design, do you think?
I think not necessarily, but so this goes back to the aspect of function versus non-function, and this is also another idea, is that does it have to be functional? And generally when we see objects, and that's how you differentiate design from art. Design is more functional. The traditional way of differentiating. Design is more functional. Art is not intended to be functional. Yet somehow, with time, you actually realize that sometimes, not sometimes, but most of the time, and throughout history, ornament has always proved to be more functional than things that have been intended to be functional.
And wouldn't you say art actually does have a function, and that is to make someone feel something?
Yes, but I think the intention, it depends on the, it varies really.
I would argue that function and intention there's like a blurred line in between, because coming from a design background and I do focus on functionality, I often do intend on being dysfunctional as I work. So I feel like you can blur those lines, and in a sense, art can be functional and fall through that pace.
Definitely. I completely agree that art can be functional, and it is functional. I think it is functional, but on first glance or first feel or whatever, it does not necessarily convey that to the viewer. But there's so much obsession with making things functional more than, often. But function, the definition of functional is very complicated because even like according to some people or according to some writers, that even the pure functionalist is not actually interested in something that is completely purely functional. If there's no element of play, it does not interest him, because the element of play is what makes contemporary art, I think, necessary.
All right. On that note, we talked a bit about the function of art. I have a question about the type of role that art could possibly play. What is the most important role that art could play in general, but specifically in the UAE and the Gulf region, the wider region as well? What do you think is the most important role that art could possibly play?
I think art has a really beautiful way of bringing people together, and also also on a educational aspect where it also helps people learn about different notions, different cultures, and different ideas. And I think that also helps develop, our society, to come a bit closer together as well.
I would say art is a vehicle of communication, of opening up conversations across people with different backgrounds. But I would also say that art can be a way to commemorate what people think and what they believe is important in this current time. Because looking back at art history, for example, you see what people deemed as important, or how people who were emperors or kings, how they wanted to have their pictures commemorated. Right now, we do that with selfies. So it reflects what we deemed as important. In some cases, it remains important. So yeah.
I feel that what is art changes from one generation to the other, because art is reflective of the times that we live in. So we talked a bit about what contemporary art is, and I feel that especially in the time that we live now, which is in an age of machines, art is what reminds us of our humanity. And I think this can, maybe it's things to do with errors or with emotion, but not just for the Gulf, but I think all over the world, art now is about what does it mean to be human. And I think that's what we need in this time of when there is so much division and everything that's going on. Yeah.
On that note, Arpana, and I know you're also a coder.
Yes.
So what do you think would happen once we actually have machines or algorithms that could actually create art? And that's already sort of happened. How would we distinguish what is human art versus machine art? And what does that mean? If by then machines could also create art, does its function still remain to remind us of our humanity, or does it assume a different role and function?
I feel that depending on the output of the machine art, it can either act as a contrast to the art that we humans create, and that would remind us of our humanity, but also it depends on who you deem the originator of the art, because humans coded it. So does that mean that we are the artist, or does it mean that we see ourselves as machines where we just run things over and over again? So I think this is a very deep question about what does it mean to be machine. So again, I think depending on the context of the machine artwork, it's a case-by-case basis, right?
Bello.
Yeah, and I mean, to talk about sort of adding to what you said is about artificial intelligence, is like what artificial intelligence does is it analyzes, but it's up to humans to make sense of that information. So I think sort of looking at what art can do and moving forward, like using technologies, like the creative mind is very human, and it's about a person's potential to like make things with the use of science, technology, whatever it is, but art or design or something creative still comes from a human. So I don't think anything will change. Like, it's just how it's being repurposed or how it's being processed.
Also, as you were talking about artificial intelligence, it made me realize that everything that we're trying to do with machines is trying to find ourselves in them, because we're trying to remake the human in the end in the machine. So in the end, it's about, again, answering the question of what does it mean to be human. So, yeah.
I think that's very beautiful. I agree about what it means to be human, or just the question about how it makes us human, but also touching on the question of the point of machines and aspects and these tools. I think there's this relationship between the human and the tool is more important than who makes the art or what makes the art, I think. And because in the end we make the tools and the tools make us, and then we make them again and then they make us. So it's just a cycle. It's a relationship.
Sort of like a feedback loop.
Yeah. So it's not about. It's not about. I mean, it's not about credit. It's not about the outcome or the output.
So to you, it's more about who made the art and why, or is it not about? Okay,
it's not about that because of this relationship between the human and the tool. It's hard to separate the human from the tool because they both make each other.
It's a really good answer. All right, and then when we talk about machines that make us and that kind of feedback loop, do we actually, how do we define what is it that's too much when we're part machine, part human? Is that something that you think is a good thing, or do you think that's actually a bad thing for us as humans in general? To become part machines, or to rely as much as we're relying on our machines and tools?
And then I think that's the question of that, are we human or not?
Machines are our friends, I think. I mean...
They are until they start taking our jobs.
I mean, I think this argument has been played off in so many different ways about whether, you know, all these tools that are coming, are they making our lives easier? Are they making them harder? Are they reducing us creatively? But at the end, you know, whether you fight against it or you flow with it, it is what it is, and the outcome towards it is up to you. So as a tool, you utilize that and you create whatever it is you want from it. And if you don't want to, that's really also a kind of perspective that you choose to do. But I truly believe that, you know, if they've created these tools, because like 20 years ago, creating a logo was nearly difficult because you had to sketch them and then you scan it and that's the logo and there you go. But right now we're in an age where all these tools are making these more possible, more opportunity for different creative outputs. So I think that, you know, embracing it will help speed the process of getting to more innovative solutions as opposed to like our threats. I don't know.
And just on that note, do you think that the pendulum is actually swinging back to the point where now people are appreciating more what has actually been taking a lot more time, what's been done by hand, the kind of craft that goes into creating something as a designer, as a creative, and as an artist as well? Does that actually like add more value to it, or do you think that's actually fabricated value that's not needed?
I think it's value that eventually grows because now we're creating new kinds of craft. It's, you know, craftsmanship is a definition that can kind of, is an umbrella that can define anything. So if I code on a computer, that is also my craft, even though I'm using a different tool as opposed to, you know, pottery and I'm using clay, and I think that they both fall under the same.
So to you, basically, the extinction of some crafts is making way to new sorts of crafts that are coming up.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
So to you, basically, what you're trying to say, I'm trying to rephrase and understand. What you're saying is that the extinction of certain crafts is allowing for more crafts to emerge.
I think there's so many different ones that are popping up, and like even the art of taking a selfie in time can become a craft in itself. I mean, Kim Kardashian created a phone that helps you do that, and people are using it as an idea of art. So I don't see why it's limited to just that.
I also think that there are machines now as well, and that can help immortalize, you know, extinct crafts or routines and rituals. So, you know, I've been hearing a lot about like VR and how that really helps, you know, bring those traditions to the forefront to make them not lost within, you know, our human narrative. So I think that that is something that is a really great aspect of what machines can do as well.
And to also kind of add to that is like, I think our current experience is like multi-tiered and it's like a multiverse. And so we have so many extended realities in which we can experience a lot more stuff. Like I can visit Japan without ever being there and I can feel what it is like there. And so I think it's very valuable to actually have access to something like this, and it also opens our mind. And I think coming to terms with it is a prerogative because like I think 50 years from now, there will be as like the new things that will come up. Like it's either we accept it or we just sort of like, but you, with or without us, it would happen. So, yeah.
On the thought of craft and different types of crafts, Salwa, I have a question for you. I know that in your practice as an architect, you rely a lot on computational design and computational modeling techniques. And for fabrication, usually most of the fabrication is done in a machined way. Do you think that takes away from the craftsmanship of actually creating something by hand, or does that sort of jeopardize traditional crafts that might not have generations studying them because of the widespread of such craftsmanships?
I think we're a long way from like letting the machine take over the whole process. So even though I do use machines in a lot of my work, in the end it ends up in a workshop with craftsmen, you know, banging it and like, you know, drilling and everything. So I think we're like quite far from that, even though that's the end goal is like using robotic arms or whatever to kind of finish or like go through the whole process. But for now, we're basically we use it at an early phase, and then it kind of goes back to the traditional techniques.
Thank you. Okay, you had something. Okay. Well, we're going to go back to the notion of what art is, and I want to ask another question that might take us into another branch of this discussion, and that's actually what defines an artist to you? When you see someone who's categorizing themselves as artists, how do you know that they are actually artists or that they're just saying that about themselves? Is there a way for you to sort of evaluate who's an artist from who's not an artist? No answers.
Okay, you're saying according to personal beliefs. I don't think it matters to determine if who's an artist or who's not. It's not about the artist, it's about the work. So, like, that question is not very...
I love hearing that. No, I love hearing that. But also,
I mean, I don't think that question matters, but it's up to the beholder to decide if the work is necessary, if the work is not necessary, if the work is executed well, or like if it's...
But on that note, you're saying that that kind of definition doesn't matter, but throughout our discussions, we talked a lot about affirmations,
yeah,
and how that sort of is the only way for you as a creative to sort of create better work is to affirm yourself that you are the definition that you aspire to be. Yeah. And that's sort of like something that's negating that point in a way.
I mean, I think the work affirms itself. I'm simply a tool in making the work, and then the work is also a tool that makes me, but it's about the work. And the affirmation in this aspect is really perceived by the viewer. The affirmation is if it's when perceived by the viewer, there's an impact, or there's a necessary outcome that comes, whether it's an emotion or etc. But that's the affirmation rather than me affirming myself.
So for you, the affirmation is in the work itself.
Yeah. And its connection to and interacting with the viewer.
But then with that, how do you actually affirm yourself if someone told you that the work is not actually a good work? Would that component of you affirming yourself not be there? Would it not sort of impact your career as an artist or as a creative?
I mean, I think that, obviously it's essential that, that's why we have critiques and we have necessary conversations that improve the work, but I think it all goes back to the intention. So the intention of this person that is critiquing or commenting on the work is the intention to alleviate the quality of the work, which by extension alleviates the culture that we live in, et cetera, or is the comment basically just to express their, to satisfy their emotions, their personal emotions, rather than what's going on around the work.
Okay, Jenan, I'm gonna rephrase the question and shoot it your way. So what defines a self-proclaimed artist from a real artist in your definition?
I think if you say you're an artist, then you're an artist. Who's gonna check? You know what I mean? And then we could loop it back and go like, oh, he's a performance artist, and his art is that he says he's an artist, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's kind of, again, like that's why it's kind of like this question that's like a never-ending kind of thing. Or you could say that if you make art, you're an artist. The art could be good or it could be bad.
But you're still an artist at the end of the day.
Yeah, even if you make like the really bad art, like you're still an artist at the end of the day. So I think it's about action. And action doesn't have to be making something physical. It could be, yeah. And that's what art is. Like you could like think it in your head and then.
Yeah.
But then thinking alone is obviously not enough because.
What if you're your own audience? Like.
Yeah. I'm not saying. Okay, so there's a line between and no. Does art have to be like that basic question? Does art have to be seen to be art? Otherwise, it's just craft. Or but then thinking alone without devising action plans to like. This, I mean, there's a necessary back and forth between thinking, writing, and making, and they all feed each other. So thinking alone is not gonna get you as far as, I mean, not you, and it's not gonna get, you know, the work as far as it should get, whether it's just like thought work.
That's true, yeah.
So, sorry, did you have something to add?
No, I mean,
Yeah.
I think he's correct, but I still don't think that it means that that person is not an artist.
I think, yeah, I mean, it's different points of view about what makes an artist. But then, Abdelghani, you mentioned that you have to be thinking in public and you have to involve other people, and thinking alone does not make a good artist. Which one do you value more, someone's opinion of your work or your own opinion of your work?
I don't think I think about it. I mean, obviously, yes, there's a lot of fear of exposing, and the thing is, I think this is where the battle is, and you're not really exposing an extension of yourself. You have to detach from the work. It's not personal. This is work, and it's not meant to satisfy your personal needs. But yes, it has to be seen, because then if it's not seen, it's just a piece of craft. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it has to be seen because it has to interact with other humans that will in turn continue this ongoing relationship between the human and the work and the tool and the human and the work.
Dina, my next question is for you. On the point of, does art or any kind of creative outcome have to be seen by people to be art? You're both an illustrator and a designer. How do you sort of consolidate the two, and do you feel like your illustrations need to be seen by people to be called art?
Not really,
because I know that you sketch a lot in your personal book, and a lot of those sketches are not seen by people until you put them on your website, and that takes some time. So in that transitional period of time, are they still artworks?
I would say yes, even though people don't see them or interact with them. At the beginning, when I was younger, I was creating art, but it was before the internet happened, or before I had access to it at least. So it was just a means of getting better at illustration, I suppose. It was a means to an end, just improving. Once the internet hit, it really, seeing other people's work, people who were my age or even younger than me, it really spurred me on. It made me want to improve and match their skill and sort of look for affirmation, I suppose.
Yeah, of course, always. And how much do you think that actually sort of informed your practice as a designer?
I would say design is different in terms of, I agree that it's functional, and I agree that it doesn't need affirmation from me myself. It more relies on the user who's going to be interacting with it. So if I'm creating a poster, it needs to be legible, it needs to be understandable, it needs to communicate certain information. If it's a mobile application, it needs to be usable by the users. They need to understand what I'm enabling them to do, basically.
All right. Well, on the same kind of question of what makes an artist, do you think self-proclaimed artists do a disservice to other artists when they do that?
I really don't think that there has to be this hierarchical notion of like who is an artist, and like, you know, as a curator who also works in an institution, like it's kind of difficult to like look at a work and be like, you know, this is not good enough yet, or like the artist's work was better in this period. You know, sometimes, you know, I fight myself with that sort of notion, and it's really hard. But I think, as I was saying earlier, like really anyone can be an artist, you know, and like I really think art is about noticing things that go unnoticed on an everyday basis, and just these artists just bring those to the forefront and, you know, share that with everyone. So art is really about sharing and connecting together.
Thank you. From your own side of impressions and observations and sort of your personal experience, what do you think makes up a fulfilled artist? And I'm talking fulfilled because I don't want to use the word successful, because success is such a loose term that's very subjective. So what do you think makes up a fulfilled type of artist?
I think I would say someone who creates a work in opposition of like what's already been done or sort of preconceived notions. So they really have their own narrative and they own it. So I'll call that a fulfilled contemporary artist.
So any artist that's part of a movement is not a fulfilled artist?
So the thing is, like, that movement was started off by completely different artists or a set of artists, and no one person can make a movement. So you could say a bunch of people who sort of like create something outside of, like, basically an opposition to what's the norm. So yeah.
Abdelghani, you have something? Or Jenan?
I think, for example, for me personally, it's about having that moment of connection with someone else. If you see someone else looking at your work and they have that kind of awe, like, oh, I get it. Like, that's the coolest thing, and I think that's what makes a fulfilled artist for me personally.
So do you feel like a fulfilled artist has to connect with as many people as possible with the subjects they choose to talk about?
I think so. If the intention is to display it, then yes.
Arpana, you had something?
I feel that the artists that are most fulfilled are ones where their work is the most authentic expression of themselves, of who they are, and by connecting to other people through that authentic self-expression, and proclaiming their beliefs and what they stand for.
So to you, a piece of work that was produced by an artist is sort of like, it represents the artist.
Yes,
While Abdelghani would disagree. To him, is the work is completely depersonalized from the artist.
I mean, okay, in terms of answering the fulfilled question, I think the fulfillment, I'm just obviously being biased and speaking from an art-making point of view. I think the fulfillment process aspect lies in the process and within the process, and and seeing how this process evolves through time is what feeds the satisfaction, and the satisfaction feeds the process, and thus achieving fulfillment.
So to you, basically, the fulfillment comes out of this artist learning about their own craft by doing it over and over again. It's like it's the learning process that to you feels fulfilled.
Yeah, like this process of making and writing and thinking that evolves through time is what creates the fulfillment.
Amazing. On a completely different subject, we're going to talk a bit more about the impressions of art in the UAE to the public, because we talked about art being seen, and we sort of are talking about how art is not art if it's not seen. Do you think art is intimidating to the public in the UAE, specifically contemporary art? Do you think it's something that puts people in this state of questioning what is it, or is there enough curiosity, or is it intimidating and that's it? Jenan?
I think it can be, yeah. I think even in public art spaces, like Sharjah Art Foundation, for example, there are still people, even though it's in a completely, it's in the city center and it's completely open and free entry and all that, there are still people who, they're like outside, like, can I go in? Like, am I allowed in here? That kind of, like, there's not enough, like, conversation about free and open public art. And I think...
But why do you think is that? And perhaps that's something that's not only there, but also everywhere else, maybe in the UAE.
I just think it's like a slow... Yani, it was like maybe 5 years ago, this scenario where people were like... And then day by day or year by year, it becomes as like people... I think because art is kind of relatively new in the region also, people just don't know sometimes.
So you think it's a matter of awareness then?
Awareness and sort of making things as public and accessible as possible. And it goes to show that even in the example I just mentioned, where it's the most public and most accessible, where even that's kind of a little bit not so accessible,
So
or
it
people
is,
don't
it is
know
accessible,
it's accessible.
it's open, there's programming all the time, but there
Yeah,
still
but there's
is.
still this like disconnect. So yeah.
And where would you put that kind of role? Is it the role of the artist, or is it the role of the institution, or who is it that has the key to basically deflate that kind of intimidation?
I mean, it's just about making people aware, I think.
I think it really depends on who you're targeting. So even if as an institution, like if they know that this is, you know, like the Youth Takeover, we are targeting the youth and the understanding of what youth has in the art scene. So aside from that, like even as an artist, I can choose to target people, because at the end, you know, even as creatives, we want to target almost everyone, you know, to help businesses, to help entrepreneurs, to help anything. So it really falls down to where you position yourself and who you want to come see. So accessibility is in your hands almost. Yeah.
All right, Abdelghani?
I just think if it's intimidating, if contemporary art is intimidating, I think it's intimidating in the sense of the intention that is set, because people might be used to traditional art in the sense that the intention set behind these forms or like these visuals are meant to please people, and now there's an art, there's another, I mean the contemporary art movement is not intended to please, and so people maybe perceive it to be, they're confused, they perceive it, they don't know how to perceive it, and they're not aware of the intentions they're perceiving, because before they were aware of the intentions they're perceiving, now they're not. Maybe, I mean, that's one aspect of it.
Salwa?
I think maybe the word intimidating isn't the right one, because it implies that you're giving importance to something that they actually don't care about. Like, this is why maybe they don't come, because they actually don't care. So
would you
it's not
say
that they're intimidated. They're just, not interested. Maybe because they don't know the narrative behind it, and maybe because they don't relate to it. But I think once they maybe hear about it or understand it, then they would be interested.
So do you think the proper word to use to describe this is more apathy? So they're more apathetic towards contemporary art, you'd say?
I would also say it's also a little bit due to a lack of understanding of what contemporary art is. So the reason they don't care is because they look at it and they're like, okay, Radin, and I think it goes back to this thing where you don't really understand, people don't really understand what contemporary art is unless they develop an interest in it themselves and look
Which
up
is okay.
Which is fine.
I feel, yeah.
That's also true. Like I was gonna say, like maybe if there was more of it in high school education or whatever, or like an earlier introduction to it, before someone has to like go like, okay, I'm interested in this, I'm gonna delve into this community. But again, yeah, it's also completely fine to not care about it.
I think I'd also just like to say that I think the UAE is a very fertile place for the arts landscape, and I think it's developing quite a lot. And even the government has decided to put arts as one of the main focus of its image, country image. So and as we start moving away from oil, building all of these museums and institutions is a really huge move, and I think that part of that is to create this sort of society that is more trying to be more accessible with everyone. So I think over time, as it gets put into education, like you said, and I think that from when kids start going from a young age to institutions where growing up here, I know we didn't have that, so I think over time, it's going to take another generation or two to really start making really big impacts.
I see. Thank you, Sara. On that note, how would you respond to someone whose attitude towards certain types of art is, I could have done that? What would you tell them? Since you work as part of an institution that deals with contemporary art, what's your kind of reaction?
Say, well, why didn't you? Yeah.
But then what if they do and they come back and they say they want to exhibit it? What do you do?
I always say they did it first, so.
I think, again, it goes back to this lack of understanding. And again, what you were saying about aesthetics and things that are aesthetically pleasing. So sometimes people will see something that is not, the prettiest thing in the world. And again, it's this moment of, okay, ubadin. And it's because of this lack of understanding of what art is, at least what contemporary art is. So it's this this understanding culturally that we have that art has to be something big and beautiful and like wow. And so when they see something that challenges that, again, maybe that's why they're intimidated by it, or they don't care about it. But I think having discussions more openly or more publicly about what art is can help people appreciate it more.
I think also people tend to forget that the final artwork that they see is not exactly the entire picture that they're seeing. The process is very much part of the practice and the artwork itself, and I think the process behind the artwork is way more interesting than what is put on the wall at the end of the day.
Yeah, and in addition to that, also the narrative that this piece of work or practice comes from. And do you think that kind of attitude, that I could have done that attitude, does it come from lack of awareness, or does it come from this feeling that these people have that art is pretentious? Do you think art is pretentious in that sense?
I think people think that, like I think you come into this like this white cube space and it feels very, almost dead sometimes, and I think that can be very intimidating. And as like you said, even like with Sharjah Arts Foundation, being in the heart of the city, and there's still that kind of like intimidation effect where people are scared to walk in through the doors. So I think definitely awareness and accessibility would be key to helping, demolish that.
Yeah. Hassan, you have something to add?
Also looking at, oftentimes people have easier access to how an artist is creating something, and like when they see them creating it, it seems like kind of easy it being done, and it's not just seeing them do it, but like when you watch movies or when you watch it kind of looks like something that could be done very quickly, and people forget, as you said, like the process that goes behind it, the narratives, where it comes from, things they need to abstract. So it's very much like there's a lot that goes into doing it, and if there's someone who says, I could have done that, and in fact does it, then maybe they should have, and they just have it in them. So yeah.
And on that point, you mentioned accessibility as something that's basically sort of putting on some fatigue on people, because they have the internet, they can see a million works of art if they wanted to in one day. Do you think that if the internet broke just now, would interest other than you having to actually send letters to people?
We'd have bigger problems.
I know, but after we solve all of those, do you think the interest in art would just suddenly rise because it becomes a lot more localized and it becomes about what's accessible geographically and physically rather than what's accessible online?
I mean, it's a very interesting question, but I'm just thinking about the how to make a watercolor painting or how to make a oil painting. And for someone who's never worked with oil or watercolor, like having access to that video makes it very interesting. But I would say it's a very two-ended question, and it's difficult to answer that. But if the internet does sort of shut down, as it happens oftentimes, they'll switch to a different medium. So that's also another alternative. So,
Jenan, you had some great.
Yeah, I feel like even if the internet broke, like people still sort of come to these, because if the internet was sort of our access to all this art, why are institutions still alive, and why is art still present? People still have this sort of connection to be physically present to experience something, and I think a screen sort of diminishes that. So I mean, I'm not really answering your question. But I feel like it's also important to know that in spite of the internet, we're still around physically, and we're not diminishing just because it's around. So.
But wouldn't you say that sort of raises the kind of bar to what institutions have to do to attract the general public and sort of engage them because of that fatigue? Because then if they see a painting that's not great, it's just normal. But if it's because they've seen it online, but if the internet was not there, for example, wouldn't they appreciate it more, would you say?
I don't know, because that's what the concept of advertising is. You know, when you see something that exists and someone is watching, you want to be there to witness it as well, and it becomes sort of like a promotional ad to go see. So I always have like a satisfaction when I've learned something in university, or like I've seen something online, but I've actually physically traveled in there, and then I'll take a photo. I'm like, I saw this. There is that still need to experience it, because it's a whole different level of conversations that happen with the artwork and you.
There's also a different type of, like, if the internet broke, we would lose meme culture, maybe, which is like another type of, I don't know, you might argue if it's art or not, but it resembles, I would say, which is what we were talking about before, which is a postmodern parody, which was what the Dada movement basically stood for. So we would lose that, I think. And then I think, yeah, with social media, you have like a different, I think it's a different type of like an art world than the physical one.
Okay. I have one last question for all of you, and then we can open the place for all questions from the audience. Do you think that some of the briefs that you guys have put together, we're trying to use memes, internet memes, as a tool to sort of examine the current moment in time? Was there any kind of intention to use the meme to have more relatability and sort of break that kind of glass ceiling or that kind of wall between art and everyone else? Was that your way of creating something more relatable and more easily understandable by everyone, and that's more accessible? Or is it only about the memes because you're interested in them?
So one thing which I'm glad like we all agreed with when we were like exploring Pace's affirmation and the now through memes is like memes are basically ideas, concepts, feelings that are simple, they're universal, and they're relatable. They could manifest in different forms. They could manifest in sort of performances or folklore or sort of different sort of visuals, but it goes beyond just the internet memes. It's like really feelings or concept or ideas that really, as like, it's evolved so many times and it still retains its original form, so yeah.
And it is sort of a reaction to your previous question, which is art pretentious? I think what surrounds art can be pretentious, and I think, or like in general in life, other things can be pretentious, and I think meme culture is kind of a reaction to that.
I think the reason that we went with this topic is obviously because we were interested in it, but the reason we were interested in it, I think, is because of that aspect of connectivity.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that we just have this necessary conversation that we started, and the memes, the memes.
That's a meme moment.
Yeah, the memes were the perfect tool to allow us to have this conversation, and through which we explored our ideas and connected them and also disconnected them.
Thank you so much. All right, we have, I think, about 20 minutes in which we can have as many questions as we can fit in. Please keep your questions as short as possible so we can have as many of them as we can. Sara.
Hi, I really appreciate all of your answers, and it's really interesting to know how all of you think in terms of your process and what is art and what is contemporary art. But what I fail to hear from the conversation is recognizing the position of privilege being in this community, whether it being in Dubai or wider UAE. We have to recognize that when we speak in regards to artists, us versus them, that there is a conversation that needs to be addressed about not just privilege through art, but also privilege through institutions. Most of you have been educated within sort of an educational framework or an institution. And so my question to all of you, whoever wants to answer, is how is your ability to recognize privilege feed into your practice, and how does that, play out in the decisions that you make, whether it's intentional or unintentional, as you say?
I think it's interesting that you mentioned privilege, but the other aspect of privilege is it's often something that you're not aware of. You need a responder to tell you that you are in the privileged position. So I don't feel like it was necessarily in the front row. Like, I can wake up, I can look at someone and go like, you're privileged because you have so and so. But the person who already has it wouldn't recognize it as privilege if it's something that's surrounding them. If you know what I mean? Like, if I look at a man and I'm like, you're privileged to being a man, how would the man understand what that is without being aware of the being conscious and present in what's happening around us? But other than that, like, it's something that's, I think, difficult to have in the front, in the front for me to acknowledge within my work.
But then that raises the question of affirmation, because if you are, isn't that what you were discussing? If you're using positive notes of affirmation, or you are identifying or self-identifying by using either deductive reasoning or whatever the case may be, you, for example, identify yourself, for example, as a woman, as a Muslim, as an artist. When you bring in work, usually we would say that work is sort of void of that, and you can take it outside of its vacuous container and place it in an environment where you don't have to be a woman to understand this work, or you don't have to be an artist to appreciate it. But you have to recognize your position because you took a position to make that work. So in a way, not failing to recognize a position of privilege then is failing to acknowledge your position when presenting that work and having it echoed back to you. So my question is, I guess to all of you, if privilege isn't at the forefront, then how does the decision-making process affect the context in which the work sits in? Because that conversation has to come up.
I definitely agree with you in the context of like privilege coming before your work, but this is a self-reflection. But there is another reflection of like, how does the society perceive your sort of interpretation of it? But it's also how do other people, so there is your own reflection, there are other people's reflection, but there's also a collective reflection. So if you think about the privilege that sort of influences the work that you create or you exhibit, if you look at placing in an institution, for example, probably the institution doesn't agree with that. So you're looking at how the society perceives your work. Or if you look at if you come from a space of privilege and you're trying to like explain your work to someone else and they don't get it, like it's also looking at, does your privilege sort of supersede their own privilege, for example? So I think it's one position to look at, and oftentimes as an artist, you would see, okay, this is my work, but what makes the work in fact interesting is how other people are able to see it from their own perspective, from your own perspective, and from like sort of like a collective view of the work. So
yeah, and I agree, but the only reason why I brought up that conversation is because you mentioned affirmation, positioning, you mentioned inaccessibility or accessibility to work, you mentioned identity through intention or unintention. So it's dancing around the idea of privilege, but no one's actually talking about it. Hence why I brought it up. So, yeah.
I think it's indirectly being spoken about, but not being spoken about, but indirectly being invested in the work or through the conversations. But also it's a big matter of perception. Like, I'm privileged to have 2 hands and 10 fingers to make my work, but I don't have a robotic hand that makes my work. For example, like, is that a it's a matter of you determining what is given to you, is it really given or is it not given? I mean, like it's this idea of separating, I mean, you decide what is given and what is not given, and you decide the privilege. So here it's very much determined by the maker. If you're talking about the idea of privilege within art making and how it plays into the decisions of art making, right?
No, I just mean privilege in general. So, for example, you went to an institution. What institution did you go to?
Like AUD.
AUD.
Okay.
So you went to AUD.
Okay.
When you produce work, you have the knowledge and understanding, the skill sets, the facilities in order to make that, and of course, the way, I guess, design or art principles in order to communicate whatever message you're trying to create. So all of you mentioned accessibility to the work, either through intimidation or ignorance of not understanding the culture, or maybe someone mentioned that the art scene is very new here, and that's all taking the position of privilege while giving such a clear answer. And that is because either there is no awareness to the fact that that is a position of privilege, but that's just something to consider, because when you discuss it, for example, within the given context of the UAE, like art has been around in the UAE for years, even before the federation happened. So to say that it's new, maybe contemporary art is new, contemporary was always around. Muhammad Ahmed Ibrahim, Muhammad Qadem, all of these artists that were coming in from the UAE. So the reason why, once again, that I bring up privilege is because our generation specifically, as you said, the Youth Takeover, have this platform to be able to acknowledge their position of privilege and see how that visually translates in their work. But it's rarely discussed because we are all kind of surrounded by people with privilege. So bringing that up in part of your practice, I think, is quite important when having that discussion. So that's the only reason why I brought it up.
Just to add, I mean, just having that kind of platform and that kind of privilege doesn't mean that the artist cannot produce something that is accessible. And that's part of the role of the artist as well, is to always outreach to different audiences, and sort of like, they are themselves, of course, privileged because they are an artist. And as an artist, you're always privileged because you have the platform of your art, and you can actually use that platform to say anything to anyone. So in that sense, it is a privilege, of course, and that doesn't negate, undermine the quality of the work. It doesn't undermine any of that, but rather actually that's something that we always also want to do, and sort of to use those platforms to always address these issues, one of which is, of course, privilege. And Bello has something to add.
To also add to that is like one of the works which like I'm personally very proud of in the Youth Takeover is the work Who Gets Paid, like who gets credited for digital labor, and it's about sort of recognizing sort of like American vernacular architect, American vernacular language, sort of the memes basically, like the eyebrows on fleek type of stuff, and it was created by unknown people, right? And it's been commodified, and so recognizing who are the people who actually created this, and so it's very interesting to kind of like look further, like some of this digital contents were created from like very sad situations, but we actually don't understand that. And so now, in what role would you create that? Would you create that in a role of also having similar experiences, or would you sort of like, you're out of the picture, but you're able to see something like that and like respond to it somehow? So it's, I feel like you have a valid point, but it's also very, it's like, it's very open-ended, and it's like, it's very personal and like how you perceive it. So.
And I think having all of you today here is also part of why we want to open these conversations, whether in this room or elsewhere. So I encourage you to continue as well on talking about it and discuss it, and bring in different artists. You can talk to Chris directly, who has the work that Bello mentioned. We have, I think, some time for more questions, so we're here.
So I wrote my question here. So in earlier times, there was an objective measure for art, aesthetics, as was mentioned. But with now, with relativism and postmodernism being a part of our lives, and this is just a comment I want to hear from the panel, no such measure exists. So there is no such thing as good or bad art, or a real or a fake artist. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Yeah, I just think it's completely subjective. It's up to the viewer to decide. So there is good and bad art in the sense that someone is looking at it and they're going to decide for themselves whether this is good or this is bad. But as an objective measure, then yeah, no.
It's just a bit irrelevant, but it's an analogy. So there's this question of good and bad design. And is good design good in the way it looks, or does it do good? So I think that also goes with art. Like, is it, so for a long time throughout history, designed objects were considered to be good if they're very smooth. The texture is very smooth. This idea of like no spots, nothing, all of like this. It's just the traditional sense, but there was no question of the functionality of the ornament, for example, in terms of design, which served more function than the functional objects or utilitarian objects. So, like, thinking about that in terms of art too, like, is good art, like, I mean, you're saying good and bad art, and then what was the other one?
So real or fake artist?
Yeah, real or fake artist. I mean, yes, I agree, it is subjective, but also, like, it's a question, what is good? Does it do good? Does it look good? Is it good in itself? What is the goodness in it?
Also,
I think there's different variables as well. So, for example, you can say, does the art do X, Y, and Z? And if it does those things, then it's good. Or if it fails to do those three things, then it's bad. So there are different ways. And again, the way of measuring depends on who's looking at it.
It just goes back, there's no objective way to measure any of this. It's completely subjective to the person seeing whatever, the art piece or whatever. Is that the case with everything? I would beg to differ. Like 1 + 1 = 2. That's subjective. You can't. There's no.
unless you're an artist, you can propose. I want to respond to that personally, and I think that's also, in definition, what defines contemporary art, because it's the lack of having an objective. It's very hard to define because there are no objective way of saying this is good versus this is bad. Arpana?
Personally, I feel that good art is art that has the ability to endure through the ages. So, for example, even though some paintings were done hundreds of years ago, even though we are worlds apart and live almost completely different lives, we still connect to the emotion in that painting, for example. So it doesn't matter if the art was made by a fake artist, as long as someone like from the past or the future can still connect with it. So I think that should be a measure of what good art is, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Arpana. We have Lana has a question, or we can go first. Yeah.
I wanted to understand a little bit more about your process. You trusted Jameel Arts Centre to put you in a room, and you met up every few Saturdays, and you came up with this project. And you've lived through sort of different roles. You've been artists, you've been commissioners, you've been present for installing the artwork for the Youth Takeover. I wanted to know if there were any moments of epiphany during this, where you were like, yes, I completely understand my role in this. And I also wanted to know if this has sort of altered your trajectory in terms of your current practice. It's open to whomever wants to answer.
No epiphanies?
I mean, I guess it was going a little bit slow in the beginning. None of us really knew each other, and we were all kind of getting to know each other for the first time. And our prompt was basically, okay, you guys, the 9 of you are in this room right now, do something. And it's going to happen in April. And we were like, okay. And we started by kind of just having conversations about these very broad topics. And then every couple of Saturdays, it would narrow down. And I think the moment where everything started to make sense is that one session where we came in with our presentations. And so we were talking about these very loaded topics, pace, affirmations, and the now, and words that mean very big things. We came in one Saturday, and our assignment, I guess, was to come and give a 5-minute presentation, each one of us. And I think that's the session where things really started to make sense. So each one of us gave a presentation about memes. And it was really interesting to sit in that room and see 9 different takes on it. And yeah, I think that's where everything kind of started to pull together.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to add that also we started without any intention of having something to show or an exhibition, or like that was not within our goals at all. We just wanted to have a conversation that was necessary, that was needed, and we didn't think at all that we were going to open it up to the public, like interact with this many people today, but it just so happened that we're lucky and that people are part of this necessary conversation that we have to say.
I think I really acknowledge, the platform that Art Jameel has given us, and I'm really grateful for that. And when I came in for that interview, you guys asked me what did you want to do with this program, and my main thing was, I brought that question kind of throughout my time here, and I just kept questioning, what is the Youth Assembly for? And I really brought it down to, well, if the Youth Assembly is for the youth, then we need to create this platform for them. And that's why, through my personal intervention that I've organized for today, later on, is a roundtable discussion where, I'm bringing together all of these local creatives to speak about their current situations in the UAE and in a very real and practical way of, what are their frustrations and what are their hopes for the future of the arts landscape. And, so I hope that these things can be realized together and bring them to the forefront.
Thank you, Sara. I think that's about the time that we have. We have one more question. Okay.
Thank you. We're so busy, caught up in our lives, so it's really great to stop and have a chance to think about, I think, these very thought-provoking ideas. My first reaction is, it's wonderful to see the amount of art that's being created. That's really fantastic. So I think we have an increasing diversity of artists now in the UAE. We have an increasing number of art institutions that support this. I think what's missing, and that might address some of the issues that are raised, we don't have people with a mass audience who can explain art to people. Right? I think that's what's missing. Now, I know people say, if we have to explain art, then it's lost its value and its meaning and things like that. But I think we have a duty, and artists are not very good about articulating things, right? So I think we need somebody else, and I don't know who it is. So I've been here I've been in this world a long time, and I think 3-4 decades ago there was this British nun, Sister Wendy, who'd get on television and talk about things, and she was passionate, and she would make these really classical pieces accessible to us, right, on television. We don't have somebody like that, I think that's what's missing.
Honestly, I'm just going to answer that very quickly. I beg to differ, and I feel like we have a lot of people, and it's just a matter of wanting to find them. Off the top of my head, I can think of Sultan Saud Al-Qasimi. He's so passionate and has a great following, and everything he does is always bringing a lot of people, and like him, we have many. But I do agree that we are always in need of a lot more people to talk about art, for sure. And that's the point of this platform, and having 9 ambassadors to talk about art to their peers and to everyone else as well.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of, my job, the role of a curator. We sit and we, explain art, and we create exhibitions for people to understand and try and make them accessible. So I'm really, passionate about that exact topic, teaching people of how to look at art and understand it, and yeah.
I feel that the world that we live in now is moving more from authority towards emergence. So for example, before, you would have to submit a book that you wanted to publish to a publishing house, and if they deemed it to be good enough, then they would publish it and you would be an author. But now you can self-publish your books, and you don't need someone else to tell you that your book is good enough to be published. So now the public audience decides what is good and not good. So I feel that having someone to tell you whether, this is art, this is what it should be, kind of like going back to how we talked about privilege, I feel that it comes from exclusivity, right? So the world that we now live in is kind of removing that, because anyone, like people have the most, a growing number of people are having the means to create art and do what they want with it and make it public and accessible. So I don't think there should be one body that tells you what is art, and let the people choose for themselves, right? So it's becoming more democratic.
Thank you, Arpana. I think this is about all the time we have for questions. That doesn't mean you can't ask questions after. There will be a tour that we're going to have all around the building to see the interventions that our 16, 17 artists have produced for this takeover. And I want to thank them by name, one by one, very quickly. We have Rakan Gracie, Muhammad Mhaysan, Inji Mahdi, Hassan Adebayo Bello, Iman Al-Hashimi, Sara Al-Meheri, Abdelghani Nahawi, Sara Agroobi, Zlatan Filipovic, Maryam Zayani, Sara Ahli, Asma Khouri, Christopher Benton, Noor Al-Mulla, and Malak Elghuel. Thank you guys so much for making this happen. And congratulations to all of you. We're going to start the tours now in the lobby by a performance by our 9th Assembly member, Shaikha Ketbi. So we'll see you all downstairs.